Everyone today. As you know, this is our weekly webinar and office hours, and today I'm going to be chatting about the when, wheres, and whys of accessibility audits. So we can jump right into it. Essentially, we're going to be covering the what, why, who, when, and how of accessibility auditing. This is going to be pretty high level, but feel free to ask any more in-depth or technical questions in the office hours session after. And as always, if you have more personal questions, feel free to ask those via our website or by email after the fact. So let's jump into it. So what is an accessibility audit? You may or may not be familiar with it, but it's the systematic evaluation of your digital content. This is a website, web app, or mobile app to identify barriers that prevent people with disabilities from using it. And the goal of an audit is to measure conformance with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Undergoing a manual WCAG audit is one of the most thorough ways, or the most thorough way, to determine and improve your website or product's level of WCAG conformance. If you are just dipping your toes into accessibility as an organization, it gives you a baseline and thorough kind of picture of where deficiencies lie and where you should prioritize remediations on your accessibility journey. And we're going to be chatting more in depth about how we conduct audits or how we'd recommend you conduct an audit. But typically that involves a combination of automated and manual assessment. Manual assessment being key here because no automated tool can detect all WCAG failures. So manual review is really critical to the audit process. Then why should you audit? Right now is actually a fantastic time to be chatting about this because there are many compliance laws coming into effect or already in effect that are likely to impact organizations, both public and private. But it's not just about, conformance with laws and avoiding lawsuits. It's also about ensuring equal access and building equitable experiences for all users. And we'll, as always, when we talk about accessibility and WCAG, it's important to understand that an accessible website that conforms with WCAG is just more usable for all users. Also indexes better for like search engines and for AI chatbots and everything. So there are many benefits to accessibility, and auditing is one of the most critical steps to getting there or all the way there. So obviously there are regulations that require you undergo audits to verify conformance, things like Title II, state level accessibility acts, Colorado and Texas, for example, have already kind of come into effect. And then international regulations as well, like the European Accessibility Act, which we just had a deadline for new and significant updated products in June of this year. And then there is another deadline in 2030 on the horizon for existing and legacy products. So now is a great time to be chatting about this because you'll want to, if you sell in the EU, for example, or if you sell to states in the US, to be planning for and thinking about thorough WCAG assessment and testing to verify your level of conformance currently, and then remediate issues to bring yourself up to a higher level of conformance on this accessibility journey. And then a kind of additional benefits and roles for auditing is just to generally reduce legal risk by assessing WCAG conformance. So, even if you are an e-commerce operation, not necessarily impacted by Title II, not doing business in the EU, there are still benefits to having a manual audit completed in that it will allow you to reduce your legal risk of lawsuits, understand deficiencies, and begin remediating them beyond just automated tools. And then it also enables the completion of the voluntary product accessibility template. You may or may not be familiar with the VPAT, but VPATs are used to create accessibility conformance reports and are an industry standard way of reporting on your level of WCAG conformance. And a manual audit is required to create a voluntary accessibility product template there and to put together an ACR. So another really critical use for these audits. And then finally, having an audit done can also support your brand reputation, inclusion goals, and SEO improvements. It's something that even your sales team can mention because it can be an asset during the sales cycle, especially as as organizations are ramping up their procurement processes and procedures around ensuring accessible ICT and accessible digital products. So lots of uses for audits there. And then who should do an audit? So, technically, you can do an audit in-house. But ideally, a third-party partner or certified accessibility specialist should complete your first audit to establish a baseline, while internal teams can build ongoing processes, shift left long-term, and think about ways to maintain accessibility. The reason that we typically recommend this is that there's a lot that goes in to digital accessibility and understanding WCAG if this is your organization's first foray in this area. And generally it goes more smoothly if we kind of divide and conquer the work. So having a third party accessibility partner review and do the audit, there's various benefits to this. There's the neutrality of a third party getting in there versus somebody on your product team who works on this product and may have their own biases. But it also allows us to just do the initial step of discovery of issues, and the contextualization of those issues so that internal teams can focus on remediation, prioritization, and shifting left and building those procedures to implement accessibility earlier in the design and development cycle next time. And then, as I mentioned, your teams can do these audits if you want to. So if you are an accessibility professional who has experience with auditing, if that's your role in the company, you certainly can do an audit internally. It won't have the same third-party legitimacy in some situations, but there are tools like Accessible Web's guided audit tool, which allow you to do this even if you're not super familiar with every WCAG success criteria. We just, it's not always the most efficient route the first time because it does take significant time to do that manual review. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we chat about some of the tests that go into each stage of the manual review process there. And then what should be audited? Ideally, all websites, applications, and digital products should undergo accessibility auditing. Without audits, without some kind of assessment of your accessibility standing, you just don't know what you don't know. And you certainly don't want to not know about accessibility barriers that could be impacting your users, or exposing you to legal risk, or threatening kind of your procurement cycle. And so when we actually scope out and conduct an audit, we are very rarely going to be auditing every single page of a website or application, every single screen, because the recommendation, kind of the W3C's methodology for scoping out WCAG assessments, is to create a representative sample that covers the core functionality. That can look like kind of core page templates if there's templating. It could be components if your website is built via component library, and critical user journeys. You essentially want to go through the website application, identify a representative sample for the scope of the audit, that covers all the unique functions, components that users could run into, in the most efficient way possible. So, if you have two product pages and one has various features and customizations available on it, and the other one is the same template but a little simpler, you're going to want to audit the more complex template, for example, because that'll give you more information. You'll be reviewing more features and components. So that's just one small example of how we tackle scoping there. Additionally, I did want to mention that this is not WCAG, not just WCAG, but accessibility assessment is not just limited to websites and applications. You also do need to be thinking about the accessibility of documents and multimedia content. I'm not going to go super in depth into this today because there are additional regulations beyond WCAG that you may need to assess some of these against, and the processes and procedures are a little bit different, but you certainly should be inventorying and thinking about other assets on the website or application, like PDFs, Word files, Google Slides, videos, audio content, because you do want to make sure that those things are fully accessible as well. And there are various kind of processes that we would recommend for different asset types that are just a little bit more efficient than having them audited the same way you audit a website or application. Yeah. And then when should you conduct an audit? This is a really interesting question. I mean, in general, obviously, before you launch or release a new product or website would be the best time to conduct an audit, so you're not releasing something that has accessibility issues. We understand that that doesn't always play out that way, so around launch is also a good time to get it done, if you were not able to do accessibility earlier in the design and development or redesign process. And then once you have an audit, or once you have that initial audit, you also want to be thinking about ongoing audits, to keep these results up to date and to ensure that new features are covered. So ideally, you would be doing audits as new features are added or significant updates are made. The way that this plays out and the timeline for this will depend largely on your organization's development cycle and kind of sprint cycle. If you're developing in sprints and releasing features all year long, then it may make sense to do smaller periodic audits as new features are rolled out, so they can be assessed and remediated in a timely manner. If you have a more annual kind of release cycle, then annual audits would obviously make sense. And there are also organizations that will choose to do annual audits just generally to keep that VPAT up to date, or to keep their VPAT and ACR up to date, and to ensure that they are just checking this box kind of like a security audit every year to verify conformance. And that simply just works best for their cycle. Most accessibility partners can meet you where you are at if you'd like to do this on a rolling basis or annually. The goal is to have a consistent process and procedure for this, to have budget for it on an annual basis, and to make sure that it is kind of top of mind as new products are planned, developed, and released. There are a couple some trigger events you might want to think about: new website redesigns, the launch or significant update of products, new platforms or integrations for your existing platform, obviously. If you receive an accessibility complaint, that's a big trigger. Or if there are significant policy or law updates. And, this year we're seeing a lot of that here at Accessible Web with Title II coming into play, the recent kind of implementation of the EAA this past June, and then the approaching EAA deadline in 2030 there. So there are quite a few laws and updates that have happened, that are motivating people to seek out audits and get ACRs or VPATs, often for the first time at this point. You may in your organization have encountered this, and if you haven't, you may start to encounter this, especially if you do any work, here in the US, to public entities, for example, or to universities that take federal or state money, counties. These are all kind of example of organizations that are covered by Title II, and so they are currently beginning to plan for next year's procurement process and the inclusion of accessibility in that procurement process more thoroughly than in past years. So I know that we've been hearing a lot of requests for third-party audits from states, from universities, from counties, as they try to figure out how they will ensure that all of their vendors are providing them accessible technology and websites and applications. So certainly something to be thinking about, and now tends to be a time for a lot of people that audits are needed. And then how do we go about conducting a manual audit? So as I mentioned previously, we recommend taking a combined approach. Automated tools can add efficiency by identifying, and in some cases, like with our tool Accessible Web Ramp, coagulating or like putting together unique element issue combinations as they appear across pages to add efficiency to the remediation process. So often, beginning with automated tools or including automated tools in your manual audit process, the way we do with our guided manual audit tool, is super helpful and just adds a little bit of extra efficiency, because that manual testing is pretty time intensive. It does require you to manually conduct a series of 100+ tests per screen or template, and that is for coverage of every single WCAG success criteria. As you can see, this little image here on the side is just a snapshot of the top part of our guided manual audit grid in RAMP, which aligns kind of closely with the format of the VPAT report or template there, because on the left side here, you have each WCAG success criteria. And then for the VPAT, the next two columns would be either supports, or would be the kind of level of conformance, and then the comment section. In RAMP, we have each template that is to be audited laid out in this grid. So as you can see here, it would look like homepage, header, footer, maybe a contact page. And this would be in line with that representative sample that I had mentioned previously that is to be covered by that manual audit. So the guide manual audit grid lets you lay out each of those in a column, and then you can actually conduct each test or each series of tests, since most success criteria include multiple tests, to verify conformance for each template and each success criteria for that template. So as I mentioned, when we do audits, we are having one of our IAP certified accessibility specialists conduct an audit against WCAG 2.2, as that is the most up-to-date version of WCAG. There are obviously that kind of back covers the other versions of WCAG, like 2.1, which you may be a little more familiar with because it is still referenced in a lot of laws and regulations, but we recommend 2.2 just because it is the most up to date. And we do expect that many of the laws and regulations will update to refer to 2.2 shortly or in their next iteration. And then, as mentioned, we use RAMP in our guided manual audit tool and the manual audit grid to provide consistent and comprehensive audit results across audits and across auditors, which I think is also really important because when you're doing this many tests, if there is not a central kind of tool or guide for how you're conducting the audit, there is the risk that each audit produces varying results, which can be super frustrating for your organization, for your developers who are trying to remediate things, and just generally decreases confidence in your audit results, which is exactly the opposite of what we are trying to do. We want you to be really confident that your audit was thorough and consistent across all templates and every iteration of the audit that goes on so that you're not frustrating you and adding rework or adding more confusion to the process. And then how can Accessible help? Obviously, as I mentioned, we do audits here in-house. We also provide tools that you can use to do those audits on your own. With that guided manual audit tool, we have a video library of tutorials. Beyond that, as I mentioned previously, there is a great benefit to shifting this left to thinking about accessibility earlier and more often in the design, development, and even just project planning process. So we often offer consulting and training. We can do sort of design reviews. We can do brand guideline reviews. Things that allow you to be more confident in accessibility from the start of a project. So hopefully there's less rework. And we also offer VPATs and ACR reports and for websites and things that might not need a VPAT, letters of certification. If you have undergone an audit, fully remediated everything found in that audit, that allows us to sign off on it and say, hey, we've assessed against every WCAG success criteria, and then they've remediated to bring their website up to speed with WCAG. All right. Awesome. And so now it is discussion time.